Hello, I'm Virginia Eskin. Welcome to First Ladies of Music, a new series about women composers. This program is underwritten by a generous grant from Northeastern University in Boston. Well, today's program is really going to be a very different one. It concerns women composers who were alive during the Holocaust and basically suffered. We've looked at what happened in women's lives in terms of whether they got support from husbands, brothers. Now you have a whole different mechanism. When the world is turned upside down, what kind of support can a woman composer look for? Not much. We're going to lead off with a powerhouse woman, Alma Mahler, who had a very long life. She lived 84 years. And we look at the pictures that survive. This is a very beautiful, we would call her a sort of superstar, gorgeous woman. I'd like to start with her early years because so often we learn a lot from the home life. She had a very supportive father. His name was Emil Schindler. He was a noted painter, and apparently he adored little Alma, and she was a beautiful child, and they went to concerts and art exhibits. He included her in their very fancy lifestyle. She was sort of the toast of Vienna. The family had a salon. She started composing at the age of 9. Vienna was a wonderful place to be alive in 1880, 1900. It was a very, very rich culture. Given all of that she has this, what we would almost regard as a perfect childhood, why doesn't she turn out as a composer? Why does she give up? Well, we'll never know because she didn't keep a diary, and those things are very private anyway. We're talking about Alma Mahler, who was married to the famous and very powerful composer Gustav Mahler, of course. And they get married in 1902, and she still is able to compose and think well of herself early in the marriage. And we know from descriptions of what was going on in the musical world of Vienna at that time, Mahler was very powerful and accessed her to a lot of not only concert life, but a lot of political power. So we're going to listen to 3 of the songs that Alma Mahler composed when she's living with Gustav. He allowed her to become his copyist, and when you do something that's as intimate as that, copying down music from manuscript, all the chord and the harmonic changes, you become very facile yourself. I would like to posit that if you heard these 3 songs and you didn't know she had composed them, you might well have thought that Gustav had composed them. They're at that level. The first one is Laue Sommernacht. The second one is Bei dir ist es traut. The third one, Ich wandel unter Blumen. Here are Alma's 3 songs.
Finsternis
You just heard 3 songs composed by Alma Mahler, sung by Suzanne Mentzer, accompanied by Craig Rutenberg. We have to always wonder what went on in Alma Mahler's life, and we'll never know, because in the end we conclude that even with her wonderful upbringing, the positive father, the access to all the salons, and the incredible social life in Vienna, it didn't encourage her enough to step out. She performed as a singer, but not as a composer. So she saw her role as helpmate, and she had the misfortune to become squashed under Mahler's thumb. And eventually, she leaves him, and she takes up with Walter Gropius, very famous architect in the Bauhaus period. And that doesn't work out to her expectations, and she divorces and marries, finally, the famous Franz Werfel. And in her memoir, she does pride herself on picking men whom posterity would consider great. That little remark tells us more about her than the men, because they leave behind a track record. Alma Mahler leaves behind gorgeous songs. We include her in this segment because she did not go, of course, to a concentration camp, but in a sense, she suffers just by being a member of her sex. The rest of the women composers we're going to concern ourselves with today belong to the Holocaust, or that period in history when lives were turned upside down. We're going to lead off with Alma Rosé, whose great role was in saving musicians. She actually knew Alma Mahler, the woman we were just talking about before. Her father was a very famous violinist. He was the principal violin of the Vienna Opera Orchestra. Alma Mahler was her godmother. She marries a violinist named Prihoda, who had an incredible career. And she was a violinist herself. Not a great one, but a very competent one. Her father had formed the Rosé Quartet, and people who knew the family expected great things from little Alma. She had a wonderful family life. If she had not been so headstrong, she wouldn't have wound up at Auschwitz. Her father was very much her mentor, and he begged her to leave early in the war and get to England, which is what he did. But Alma had a different trajectory. She decided to sort of take advantage of World War II, and we're talking now in the early stages, long before the camps are really underway. We're talking 38, 39. She traveled a great deal. There was a lot of need for concerts. Ironically, you'd think that the whole European community would have shut down, but they didn't. And she traveled around. She went up to Holland. She did visit her father in England, and he begged her to stay. But no, she once again went back to Holland because she was quite ambitious for herself. And she did not have a happy marriage with Prehoda. He did not encourage her. Eventually, she is deported to Auschwitz, and that is really where her story begins. And there's a wonderful book written by Richard Newman called Vienna to Auschwitz, and it is a fascinating read because it goes into very great detail about her life, what led up to it, life in the camp, and the musical aspects of what was allowed. She gained such power, this little Jewish woman violinist, that when transports would be coming to Auschwitz, she would go to the SS guard and say, I need a cellist. The orchestra needs a violinist. And by the way, we only have 2 flutes. And the Gestapo guards, this is one of the horrific ironies of the Holocaust. They loved music so much that they empowered Alma, and she saved many, many lives. Nobody knows in numbers whether it's hundreds, but it's a lot. She saved a lot of lives. She had a wonderful orchestra. She was a conductor. And she'd had some experience doing that because early on, way back in the turn of the century when she was a young woman, she had established an all-women's orchestra. And there was a great appetite for that. And that was coming out of the tradition of Johann Strauss, the Waltz King. And her all-women's orchestra was kind of a bit of fluff. Well, once she arrives at Auschwitz, she realizes this is the end. This is the end of the line. It's her finest moment. She buried her ego, and she saved lives. She somehow found the energy and the resources to create an orchestra that really kept people alive in the camps. Listening to the rehearsals, it gave them something else to fasten on from the misery of the daily life. What we'd like to share with you now is Alma Rosé's poem. It's going to be spoken by our producer, Carolyn Pollan. And underneath, you will hear Chopin's Etude in E major, which was the music that Alma Rosé used. Eventually, that was made into several popular songs. But this is just the pure version, and you'll hear Rosé's poem. And this was composed at Auschwitz.
In me echoes a song, a beautiful song, and brings back memories. My heart was still. Now those sweet sounds emerge again, reviving in me echoes of a life far removed, of dreams no longer mine. My heart, you were dormant for so long, but now all my desire, all my happiness springs up again. Deep longing, sleepless anguish. Everything now comes to life. Yet I only want peace for my heart. Rest is all I want. Never again to think of the beautiful song.
What you just heard was our producer, Carolyn Pollan, pronouncing the poem that Alma Rosé composed when she was at Auschwitz, and I was playing underneath it the Chopin E major etude. As I said before, Alma Rosé was not an out-and-out composer. We include her because her role was so strong and so amazingly important as a musician. When she finally arrives at Auschwitz, she creates the famous orchestra and saved many, many, many lives. Now, our next woman composer has an equally interesting story, and her name is Ilse Weber. She's actually not a Jewish woman. Her husband was Jewish. She was not. She and the two little boys were all sent to Terezin, and there's a whole interesting reclamation project about the musicians who were shipped to Theresienstadt, or sometimes it's called Terezin, which was the town, and it was a garrison fort that went way back in Czech history, and it was commandeered by the Nazis to be what is called a paradise camp. And of course, that's horrifically ironic. Paradise it wasn't, because many musicians were deported and never came back. The bulk of them, in fact, left in 1944. Many famous men, Victor Ullmann, Gideon Klein, Hans Krasse, they were all interred at Theresienstadt. We're going to concern ourselves with Ilse Weber, who was a nurse there, and her role was also important. She helped the children at Theresienstadt to compose music, and she had help from the children in writing the words that go with the songs. There are about 10 of these that survive. And if you go to Yad Vashem, they have little drawings that the children make that go with the songs. The famous I'll Never See Another Butterfly comes from this period. One has to look back, and it's impossible to imagine what it would have been like to be in a concentration camp. For children, it must have been bewildering. To say it was sad doesn't really do it justice. So the miracle is that music and art were allowed to become this very important part of the day. They were all dressed up and fed, and then they were told they should be part of a sort of a large activity, because, of course, the Red Cross came and visited those camps, and the Nazis would strut out all the artistic things that were going on. And there's an opera that comes from this period, Brundabar, that was written by the children. I asked myself, why don't we know about this? Because all of this was happening back in the 40s. And I was told it's so painful for survivors. They will not talk about it. It's the sort of thing that a veil is drawn across an experience when you've been in a concentration camp. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to go there. So it's up to us now to highlight and bring to light what went on, and what better way than with music. Now I want you to hear a little song that Ilse Weber composed at Theresienstadt. It's a little lullaby called Wiegala, and listen to the really subtle way she composes the accompaniment. It's sort of almost like a barcarolle. It's sung by mezzo-soprano Isabel Gans with pianist Mimi Stern-wolfe.
Die Nacht, die kalt, die singt ihr Lied.
You just heard Wiegala, composed by Ilse Weber, was sung by mezzo-soprano Isabel Gantz with pianist Mimi Stern-wolfe. You're listening to First Ladies of Music. We'd love to hear from you. You can send your comments via email to ladies@wfmt.com. You're listening to the WFMT Radio Network. Our last woman composer is very powerful, even though she had a very short life, 1915 to 1940. The whole story of Vítězslava Kaprálová is very interesting. Her father was a famous composer and teacher at the Brno Conservatory, and like some of the other women on this program, she did enjoy access to famous composers of the time, people like Janáček and Martinu. It's easy to compare her music to the more famous Czech males, but I think she has her own voice, and I just wish she had been allowed to have a longer life. From the age of 18, her music is being published and performed. This would be in 1933. It's being favorably reviewed, and it's high praise. She's getting all of her works published. As a graduation concert from the Brno Conservatory, she conducts the first movement of her piano concerto. She wins prizes. In October of 1935, she goes to the Prague Conservatory and studies conducting with Václav Talik and composition with Vítězslav Novák, a pupil of Dvorak. She graduates with distinction in 1937, and she gets a one-year scholarship to study in Paris. If World War II hadn't intersected her life, she would have had a very rich and fleshed out life. Instead, because of the Nazi upheaval, she is attempting to evacuate herself and avoid the Nazi invasion of Paris. She flees south to Montpellier, and she contracts tuberculosis and dies. I would like to perform a little piano piece that she composed as a young girl, and it's full of this kind of dark flavor that we associate with Czech music. When you say the name Janáček, Suk, Martinu, you think of very dark, rich, plummy music, and Kaprálová's music belongs to that. And we've mentioned before atonality on our series. You'll hear in this tiny little folk piece, it's studded with atonality, but it's so charmingly done. I'd like to play it for you. It's called Little Song. I just played for you Little Song, composed by Vítězslava Kaprálová. I'd like you to hear the April Preludes, or Dubnova Preludia. In the third movement, you'll hear these pitches. The reason I mention that is because in Europe, ambulance pitches are like that, and during the time of the Holocaust, the vehicles that came to take the Jews away sounded like that. And that sound had a very awful connotation. It usually meant that people were being rounded up. Kaprálová has put this in her music, and other composers who composed at Theresienstadt did the same thing, because of course, artists are the filters of society. So if you're in a bad situation, your music and your art are going to reflect that. Here is Kaprálova's Dubnova Preludia for piano. The suite is played by pianist Jaroslav Smikal on a recording from the Czech Republic. You've heard the Dubnova Preludia of Vítězslava Kaprálová, played by Czech pianist Jaroslav Smikal. We're going to end our program with Kaprálova's String Quartet. The work is her 8th opus. She composed about 25 opuses that we know about. The thing that's interesting to bear in mind is that Kaprálová studied at the Prague Conservatory. She finalized this quartet during that time. She finished it in the early spring of 1936. And I guess one would have to say that it's influenced maybe a little bit by Janáček, although it's barely detectable. And again, she has her own voice. What do I mean by that? When I listen to the string quartet, I don't hear a macho male Czech quality. It sounds like a poignant young woman writing music from her heart. The Janáček String Quartet will perform the String Quartet of Vítězslava Kaprálová, written in 1935 and 36, when she was just 20 years old. Vítězslava Kaprálova's string quartet was performed by the Janáček String Quartet. Well, in winding up this show and thinking back over the title, we called it Holocaust and Suffering, I think it's sort of amazing what a terrible situation does to people. It either brings out the best or the worst. Women have historically been able to respond to tragedy. We've often spoken of how music was used for laments, balm, salvation. Music played an incredible part in allowing people, individuals, to survive the Holocaust. It's unfortunate that the Nazis used music as a weapon. Apparently, if the workers didn't work hard enough, or if they felt they weren't making enough cement or cracking enough rocks or whatever the work was of the camp, they would punish the prisoners by not having a concert. It's an extreme example of music being used to buoy the consciousness and to make people feel alive and human. I hope you've learned something and will think about women during the Holocaust period in a different way. Thank you for being with us. First Ladies of Music with Virginia Eskin is produced by Carolyn Pollan from the WFMT Radio Network. Steve Robinson is the executive producer. The engineer is Mary Mazurek. Thanks to Alice Abraham, librarian at WGBH Radio in Boston. And special thanks to Boston's Northeastern University for their generous support. I'm Virginia Eskin, inviting you to join me again next time for First Ladies of Music. This is the WFMT Radio Network.